College president says the sexual harassment wave shouldn't surprise anybody because we spent decades literally training children to behave this way. That college president joins us next. A lot of people were caught completely off guard by how sexual harassment took over the news this fall, but to Everett Piper, who's the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, all of this was, quote, as predictable as the sunrise. In a recent piece, Piper says, quote, all we need to do is look at our public schools and what we've been teaching for the past several decades. For years, our schools have mocked morality. Why are we now shocked to find that we live in a society there's no understanding of personal morality? Everett Piper is also the author of the book, Not a Daycare, The Devastating Consequences of Abandoning Truth. He joins us tonight. Mr. Piper, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Tucker.
So flesh out what you mean by that. You were not surprised because why?
Well, I believe that ideas have consequences. I'm an educator. I believe that what's taught today in our classrooms will probably be practiced tomorrow in our culture. And when we teach sexual license rather than sexual morality, when we teach that sex is recreational rather than moral, we shouldn't be surprised to find a culture of men that behave licentiously. This is predictable. When we teach that sex is something that you can experiment with rather than something that you should be morally responsible for, I think you can see what you're going to have in culture as a result of that.
I agree with that, of course. I mean, I think you're obviously right. But it's a little more complicated than that, in that the people who are pushing licentiousness are also sort of pushing a kind of puritanical view of sex. Expressions of sexual desire are both encouraged, but they're also penalized by the same people, if you see what I mean. And so I find it confusing that way.
Well, I'm not too sure what you mean with regard to those people that are pushing licentiousness are also being puritanical. What I see in our public schools, for example, and when I say public schools, I don't mean any local district or any particular teacher. What I mean is our national educational system is known for doing what Jay, Oklahoma does, and Edmond, Oklahoma, and Cherry Creek, and Fox Ridge, Colorado, and Yale and other institutions in the Ivy League, and then those institutions and universities on the West Coast such as UCLA and Berkeley. All of these institutions have been celebrating sexual license for decades. In other words, they've been giving instruction manuals, literal instruction manuals, on how to engage in sexual activities with the hope and the prayer that a thin layer of latex will keep our kids from getting a disease. Now, when there is no moral boundary left in that educational discussion other than consent, if you can merely find somebody that will consent to your libidinous appetite, then what was wrong 5 minutes ago all of a sudden becomes okay because you found a willing accomplice. When that is the discussion that it revolves around the sexual appetite of our culture, then we're going to have a predictable consequence that you see on the nightly news, and that's why I'm talking to you.
So what would you teach if you wanted to prevent what we're seeing now?
Well, I think you teach that sex is a moral decision and not something that floats with culture. I don't think that you... Let's get to the issue of morality being judged by consent. Consent puts all responsibility onto the other person, and it puts no responsibility on you. And like I just said, what was wrong 5 minutes ago all of a sudden becomes right if I can just find a willing accomplice. Hopefully, we all recognize that morality has a more objective definition and standard than merely dumbing it down to the consent of another party. So do we agree that sex is a moral discussion, or is it just a recreational discussion? If we all agree that it's moral, and I would argue that culture is showing its cards right now and agreeing that it does, great, we all agree. Now, where does that moral standard come from, and can we discuss it as being an objective standard rather than a postmodern construct?
Interesting. Mr. Piper, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.